What's up producers, it's Aden with EDMProd, and if you're anything like me, when you started producing electronic music, writing EDM chord progressions was a massive struggle, even though I knew both music theory and played an instrument. The good news is though, that EDM chord progressions don't have to be difficult at all. Whether you are a complete beginner or a more seasoned producer, and no matter what genre you make, these tips can help you improve your songwriting skills and help you make great sounding tracks like this. We're gonna go over great techniques like the power of using the right chords in the right order, chord extensions and voicing, and using multiple instruments to create fuller chords. So make sure you stick around to the end to get all of these tips. So let's not waste any more time. Here are 5 tips to take your EDM chord progressions to the next level. Now, if you are a beginner, you might be asking, well, what is a chord progression? Or what even is a chord? I know what it sounds like, but how do I actually make them? Well, basically it's a combination of 3 or more notes simultaneously playing to create harmony, like so. Imagine having different flavors of ice cream all blending into one to create something different and amazing. That's kind of what a chord is. Now, there are different types of chords, but most of them are based off 3 notes, known as triads. Triad chords can be either major or minor. These are the 2 main types, but they can also be diminished, augmented, or suspended. These chords are typically used to add tension and suspension to the track. They tell kind of more of a story, especially used in the more jazzy side of EDM. Now, major chords have a formula of 1, 3, 5. Now, if you can't remember that, if you don't know how semitones work yet, just remember to count up 4 notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, then count up 3. 1, 2, 3. Now, major chords sound happy and bright, whereas in contrast, minor chords, which have a formula of 1, flat 3, 5. Once again, if you can't remember how semitones work, just count up 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So the opposite of a major chord. Now, it's all well and good to know how to make these types of chords, but how do we know what sounds good together and what doesn't? Now, in a given scale, there are a different number of chords of different types that all work together. When the chord fits into a particular scale, it is called diatonic. They are represented as Roman numeral capital letters for major chords and lowercase for minor chords. There are other notations too, but let's not worry about those for now. Here are the different chords you can use depending on whether you are in a major or a minor scale. Here is what all the chords in C major sound like. So remember, C major is just all the white notes if you haven't heard that before. Now, chord progression is simply a combination of these chords over time in a particular order. This basically creates emotion and movement to a song and tells the story of a track. The problem is, how do we know which chords to put where? Well, this handy chart explains the journey that chord progressions can take. Although you are free to experiment and break these rules, these provide a guideline for what sounds catchy and harmonically pleasant. For example, let's listen to a simple 1, 5, 6, 4 chord progression. This is a very, very common chord progression that you'll come across in heaps of different tracks. But basically, we have the root chord C major, then we have a G major, which is the perfect 5th, that's also a major chord, A minor, a minor chord, which is the minor 6th, and then lastly F major, which is the major 4th. And that's essentially the basics of how to create a chord progression. As long as you follow these guidelines, you will always get great results, and then you can start to experiment beyond and see what works in your tracks. And one vital tip here is to look at the chord progressions of your favorite songs. You can't copyright a chord progression, and you'll be surprised how much music actually shares the exact same chord progressions, even if it doesn't sound like it. And to help, this chart will be included as part of our PDF cheat sheet, which you can down below in the description. Now, after most producers learn the basics of chord progressions, there is a big problem. Most producers simply just place one chord per bar and just use the 4 chords like we did in the last example. Now, this is a very effective technique and it is used by a lot of producers, but although it's a great starting point, to stand out and be a bit creative, you need to get a bit more wild with the rhythm. So let's listen to that in action. So firstly, I've got just the simple chord progression from last tip. And here is one with the rhythm varied a bit more. Notice how it's a bit more dynamic and moves a bit more and it's a bit more fun. That's the power of changing the chord rhythm, and it's a tip I really love to use. So start by trying to blur the lines of your chords so they start a beat earlier or later, or so they leave some gaps between the next chord. The chords can start to function as more of a rhythmic element and help people get into the song more. And this is really good, especially if you're making dance music. Another great tip though is to have them shorter or longer than 1 bar. For example, back here, this chord lasts almost 1.5 bars, nearly 2 bars. Try experimenting with things like that. Doing this can add an element of surprise and delight to your tracks, which your fans may love. It's kind of like traveling down a familiar road, but this time they've built a coffee shop on a nearby street, which wasn't there before. To take this even further, try messing around with the timing of different notes coming into the chord, like so. It adds definitely like a different element to the track, which is super cool and super creative. Lastly, it can be cool to use different rhythmic variations for different sections in the track. So try playing around with it. It'll encourage a sense of familiarity, but also change throughout the track to keep things fresh. Now you know how to make a great chord progression and you know how to make it rhythmically interesting, but how about harmonically interesting? Well, these next 2 tips will go into how to make your chords really pop. Now imagine you're a chef and you're given like rice, sauce and chicken or something, and you think, well, all I can make is chicken stir fry, right? But in reality, you could make soup with a sauce, you could leave out the rice and add more chicken, etc. The main point here is that with the same 3 notes, you can arrange them hundreds of different ways, on different octaves, with different gaps, and with different velocities, for example. Now let's hear how the power of voicing works. The first progression has all the chords in what is known as root position, which is a fancy way of saying the normal way. And the second one has the voicings altered. So let's hear the difference. Compare that to... Notice how the second sounds a lot more powerful and flows beautifully. That's an example of chord voicing in action. So what have I actually done here? Well, firstly, I've moved some of these chords into different inversions. An inversion is basically where the bottom note of the chord is different than its root position, like it was in the first example. For example, the bottom of this G major chord here, I'll highlight it, is now a D. This is called second inversion because the second note that isn't the root. So for example, I'll put it into normal position just so you can see. D is normally the top and it's the second one up that's not the root is now the root. So we've moved it down the bottom by moving it down an octave. For example, if this B was at the bottom, that would be first inversion. This technique is known as voice leading because the individual of the notes of the chord, so they've got like their own smooth path and it's like they're functioning as their own melody. Think of it like walking on a flat path instead of like a super mountainous one, like they all kind of went up and down before, but these ones have less gaps between them. But secondly, in this example here, I have doubled up on some of the bass notes. It spans multiple octaves, but it also fills up the spectrum and sounds a lot more gripping than its original counterpart. So notice that these are the roots of the chord. So technically this is root position because you got C, G, A, and F, which are the normal roots. It doesn't matter about what's up here. Technically, the chords are in root position. One important thing to note here is that the lower the notes you're playing, the bigger the gap between the notes should be. Otherwise, things start to get muddy. At the lowest point of the keyboard, for things to become like atonal, like down here, if you can even hear. Yeah, like that. I'd only recommend doing 1 octave or a fifth between notes. For example, if you're playing a C, the max I'd recommend is doing like a G here. Anything less would start to sound too muddy. For example, if we were to do like a... Sounds alright, but it just sounds not as nice. So up high, you can get away with lower notes. You can even have notes like right next to each other if you're doing other types of chords, which we will get into in a bit. And lastly, the velocity of the note is extremely important and overlooked. So I have reduced the velocity of certain notes here to accentuate other ones, and it just helps color the chord a bit more. And you can kind of think of it as EQ, but on a note level instead of a frequency level. Just helps to bring out certain qualities in the chord. And with these chord voicings, smooth and less jumps can be nice, but sometimes it's fun to have an experiment, like go wild, like add notes and have massive jumps between notes. You can get some crazy results, and you can also try filling out the entire spectrum with notes that are all in the same chord, multiple octaves, like something like this. Like, you could do that if you wanted to. Feel free to go nuts and see what works for your track. I'll be honest, chord extensions are probably one of my favorite techniques because they sound so damn good. It's kind of the equivalent to getting like extra birthday presents. The other presents are good, but sometimes an extra present or two makes the whole birthday experience different. Now, we can arrange our chords however we like, as we've learned, but let's take it further by looking at chord extensions. Now, remember how I said that most chords have 3 notes and are called a triad? Here's where we start to add more notes. So this is without. Here is with. I've moved it down an octave just for this example. Now these notes here are known as 7th chords because they contain the 7th note along from the root of each chord. If you remember that formula of 1, 3, 5, now it's 1, 3, 5, 7 for a major chord. B being the 7th note here. Now, as you can probably tell by the sound of it, these chords have a very jazzy sound to them and are great for adding smoothness and emotional qualities to a chord that just extend beyond the triad here. Now the main types of 7th chords are major 7th, which is a major chord like this here, with an extra note 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones up. You've also got a minor 7th, like this, a minor 7th chord here, which is a minor chord, like the A minor, with a extra note 3 semitones up, 1, 2, 3. And you've also got a dominant 7th, which is a major chord like this G major here, with an extra note 3 semitones up. Dominant chords particularly have a very tension-y sound to them, so that's why you might notice it sounds a bit funny in this chord progression, but it's on purpose so that it kind of tells a story. There are also diminished and half diminished, as well as minor major 7ths, but that's starting up to venture off into more advanced theory, and they are used heavily in the jazz-influenced EDM scene. Like with triads, there are 7 chords that are diatonic to a particular scale, following the exact same pattern, just with an extra note on top. But it doesn't stop at 7th chords. You can have 9th chords, or even 11th or end 13th chords, if you're that adventurous. But after that, you're essentially playing an entire scale at once, so be careful unless you know what you're doing. And yes, you can invert all of these chords and voice them however you like, change the rhythm and whatnot, so pretty much go nuts. Now, what do you notice about this progression? And this progression? I get rid of this, essentially they're the exact same chord progression, but the notes are spread out over different instruments and sounds instead. Now our final chord progressions tip, and this is my personal favorite, is to use the power of timbre in your tracks. That is, chord progressions sound incredible when a variety of instruments all contribute to the sound. This is why orchestras sound so damn good. A talented pianist could probably play all the same notes on a piano, but it doesn't sound quite as impressive. That being said, it can be helpful to sketch out the notes you want on a piano or a piano roll first, like I've done here. Because it sounds good on a blank stock piano sound, it'll sound amazing when brought into the context of multiple instruments. Now what I've done here is I've split the bass and the other parts of the chord into two instruments. I'll play the first upper part of the chord here. And then you've got the bass. And then I've added some other intervals to the chord on this kind of more bell sound here. Just to add some extra harmonic emphasis. And lastly, I've just got kind of a droning one here which overlaps one of the notes, particularly this C here, and then the B as well. Oh, actually, no, we go for the A, don't we? Yeah. So it just overlaps a lot of the notes that the chords all share, just to kind of tie it all together, which is really nice. Of course, the sounds you choose here do matter, but this is just an example of how a chord progression can sound good in a full arrangement. And as like a little side tip as well, most synths, for example, like Serum, have a coarse pitch setting that allows you to adjust the semitones of an oscillator. You can use this on a second oscillator and pitch it up or down 5 or 7 semitones, to add extra harmony to your notes. This can help to fill out your chords a lot more and give them a bit more of a jazzy feel. But just be careful, because as we mentioned before, chords with a lot of extensions start to sound very out of key unless in the right context. So adding fifths, which is essentially what you're doing when you're going up or down 5 or 7 semitones, can make the chords sound like they belong elsewhere. So use this tip pretty sparingly and always use your ears first. Using all of these tips, you'll be able to create fuller, nicer, and more unique EDM chord progressions. Understanding how these tips work can not only help you in your own tracks, but help you to analyze other people's tracks and hear what you like about them. As well as if you're having more of a sample-based workflow, you can understand the theory behind some of the more harmonic samples if you're using chord sounds or something like that, and how they actually contribute to your song. And the more you work on chord progressions, the better you'll be able to understand them and use them to the fullest of your ability. Now, if you want these chord progression tips in a nice, neat format, something that you can stick on your studio wall, etc., click the link below to download a free EDM chord progressions cheat sheet that we made. That way you can constantly remind yourself of these tips that we discussed in today's video. Also, leave a comment down below, tell us which track has your favorite chord progression. What we'd recommend is try find the MIDI online, dissect it, or just try recreating it on your own. I'm keen to hear what inspires you all. Also, if you're leaving today knowing more about EDM chord progressions than you did before, feel free to drop us a like down below. Make sure to subscribe for more tutorials in the future and videos of all sorts. Lastly, if you have any producer friends who you'd think really benefit from some EDM chord progression tips and tricks, make sure to share this video with them so they'll be able to get these tips too. Alright, thanks guys. See you in the next one. Peace.